not a cure. He avoided the camera all day. It sat in the corner, a silent accusation. He was afraid of what it might show, but he was more afraid of what it wouldn't. If the camera showed nothing, as Lena predicted, then he would be left alone with the cold spot, with the memory of the touch a ghost no science could exorcise. The cautious optimism of yesterday had curdled into a familiar, gnawing dread. He procrastinated, finding busy work, tidying already tidy surfaces, until the sun began to set and the shadows in his apartment grew long and deep. He couldn't put it off any longer. With a deep breath, Alistair retrieved the memory card and slotted it into his laptop. He pressed play. The footage was excruciatingly mundane. Just him, a figure under a gray duvet, tossing and turning. The timecode in the corner crept forward. He fast-forwarded through hours of restless sleep, a growing sense of disappointment mixing with relief. Lena was right. There was nothing there. He was just a man, alone in his room. But the cold spot on his cheek seemed to throb. It wasn't enough. He plugged in his headphones, determined to give the experiment its due diligence. He went back to the section of the night where the paralysis usually struck, around 4 a.m. He closed his eyes and listened, immersing himself in the audio track. There was the low hum of the air conditioning, the distant siren, the rustle of his sheets. And then, through the hiss of the static, he heard it. It was faint, tinny, a distorted, music box melody. He strained to hear it, turning the volume up until his ears hurt. It was a nursery rhyme, a simple, looping tune he hadn't heard in years. His daughter's favorite. The realization hit him not as a thought, but as a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath. He remembered, standing in the overwhelming sensory chaos of a garden center on a sunny Saturday. His daughter, Chloe, her small hand in his, pointing at the row of kitschy lawn ornaments. That one, Daddy. The smiler. He remembered buying the cheap, cheerful gnome because she loved it. He remembered her singing that same nursery rhyme in the car on the way home, off-key and joyous. It wasn't a random monster. It wasn't an intruder. It was a vessel. A piece of a day he had buried so deep he'd thought it was gone forever. The terror in his chest instantly transmuted, shifting from a fear of the unknown to the far greater, sharper horror of the known. The gnome wasn't trying to hurt him. It was trying to show him something. The memory, now unlocked, guided him. He moved as if in a trance, crossing his silent living room to the heavy oak desk that served as the centerpiece of his forced order. He knelt. His fingers fumbled with a small, hidden latch on the back panel of the bottom drawer. It clicked open, revealing a small, hollow space. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed velvet, was the snow globe. He hadn't touched it in 5 years. He lifted it out, his hand trembling slightly. It was small and cheap, the plastic base of faux grain. Inside, a miniature, brightly painted gnome stood beside a tiny plastic mushroom. He held it up to the weak afternoon light, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams. With a hesitant movement, he turned it upside down and back again. The white plastic flakes swirled, a miniature blizzard that fell on the tiny, smiling gnome. And with the snow, other fragments fell through his mind. The brilliant warmth of the sun that day, the smell of potting soil and fertilizer in the garden center, the sound of Chloe's laughter, a bright, clear bell he hadn't allowed himself to hear in years. It was painful, a deep, aching sorrow that felt like a physical wound reopening. But it was no longer a terrifying, formless abstraction. It was real. The grief had a face, and her name was Chloe. Fear began to give way to a grim, painful resolve. When Elias sat down for his next session, something in the room had shifted. The air was still, but it was a different kind of stillness, less clinical, more present. Elias spoke of his guilt again, the same circular story of the pool gate, The momentary lapse that had cost him everything. But this time, Alistair didn't flinch. He didn't retreat behind a wall of therapeutic jargon. He listened, truly listened, and saw not just a client's pain, but a reflection of his own. When Elias finished, his story hanging in the quiet space between them, Alistair did something he had never done before. "Guilt is a story we tell ourselves," he began, his voice softer than usual, stripped of its professional armor. "We tell it to punish ourselves, to try and make sense of the senseless. But sometimes," he paused, his gaze meeting Elias's, "sometimes we have to let ourselves read it to the end." It was a piece of advice, but it was also a confession, a promise to himself. In that moment, he was no longer a doctor treating a patient. He was just a man, speaking to another from a place of shared, broken humanity. He was preparing himself. That night, there was no fear. There was a solemn, terrifying calm. Alistair moved through his apartment with a quiet, ritualistic deliberation. He poured a single glass of water and set it on his nightstand. He took the snow globe from his desk and placed it beside the water, its tiny inhabitant a silent sentinel. He got into bed and lay flat on his back, his hands resting on his stomach. He didn't fight. He didn't brace himself. He focused on his breath, deep and rhythmic, in and out. He waited. When the familiar, leaden weight began to creep into his limbs, he did not resist. He surrendered to it, letting the paralysis take him. When his body was locked, a statue of flesh and bone, he opened his mind. He focused on the corner of the room, on the deep shadows where it always appeared. "I'm ready," he thought, the words a clear, silent broadcast into the darkness. "Show me." A moment passed, then another, and then, scrape. In the corner of the room, the sitter appeared. It began its walk, but this time, the grating sound was not a threat. It was an answer to a summons. The sitter reached his bed. The scraping stopped. Alistair watched, his mind a sea of calm resolve, as the small ceramic hand rose once more. It placed its palm on his forehead. The world dissolved. He wasn't in his bedroom. He was in his car. The sun was blindingly bright, pouring through the windshield. He could feel the cheap, sticky warmth of the leather steering wheel under his hands. Beside him, his wife, Helen, was talking, her voice tight with an annoyance that was the hallmark of their last few months together. It was a banal argument about being late, about directions, about something so meaningless he couldn't grasp the words. From the back seat came the sound of off-key singing. Chloe. She was buckled into her car seat, kicking her little legs, singing her nursery rhyme. Alistair felt a surge of love so fierce it was painful, followed by a wave of irritation at the argument with Helen. "Just let me look at the map," he said, turning to Helen. And in that moment, he turned his head. He took his eyes off the road. Just for a second. He turned to look at Chloe in the rearview mirror, to catch her eye, to share a secret smile. The world exploded in a symphony of violence. The shriek of tires. The monumental, deafening roar of impact. The crystalline, percussive sound of shattering glass. And then silence. An abrupt, profound, and absolute silence that was louder than the crash itself. He was forced to watch it all. He couldn't blink, couldn't turn away. He had to feel every ounce of the guilt, the regret, the searing, unimaginable grief he had run from for 5 years. He saw his own failure, his stupid, unforgivable mistake, laid bare and undeniable. A single, agonized sob, raw and animal, broke from his paralyzed body, the first true sound of his grief made manifest. The memory faded like a photograph bleaching in the sun. The roaring silence receded, replaced by the low hum of the air conditioning in his bedroom. He was back. The paralysis lifted, not suddenly, but like a receding tide. Sensation returned to his limbs, and with it, the full weight of the memory he had just relived. He curled into a fetal position, his body shaking, and wept. Not the quiet, controlled tears of his clients, but wrenching, soul-scouring sobs of a man utterly broken. He wept with an honesty he hadn't known in years, for his daughter, for his broken marriage, for the hollow shell he had become. As the first, faint light of dawn filtered through the window, staining the darkness gray, he looked to the spot where the sitter had stood. The figure was still there, but it was different. It was translucent, its colors faded, its form wavering like a heat haze. It was losing its substance, dissolving with the darkness that had given it form. It gave him one final, blank look, not of malice, not of judgment, but of a task completed. And then, as the sun's rays finally touched the floor, it dissolved into nothing. The room was empty. The silence that remained was no longer oppressive. It was just silence. Later that morning, Alistair sat on the edge of his bed. He was exhausted, hollowed out, but a deep, quiet calm had settled in his bones. He held the snow globe in both hands, turning it over and over. The cold spot on his cheek, the phantom touch that had haunted his waking hours, was gone. He looked around the room. The shadows in the corner were just shadows. The hardwood floor was just a floor. It was just a room. He stood and walked to the nightstand, placing the snow globe beside the glass of water. He would not hide it away again. It would stay here, a reminder not of the horror, but of the love. He picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over the contacts list, then scrolled to a name he hadn't called in years. Helen. With a deep, steadying breath that seemed to come from the very core of his being, he pressed the screen. The phone beeped quietly as the call connected, the sound small in the warm, clear light of the new day. He was ready to tell the story, the real story, and he was ready to read it to the end.